Hello and welcome to the lore you know.
Hi.
Sarah's tired and I'm sick, and so I'm going to be mostly quiet and she's going to be a little quiet. So hopefully today will be, all right
I'll
for
get my
everyone
energy
watching,
back. I'll
right?
get my. I mean, you sick. You better not be
Uh,
the C word.
no, it's sinuses.
Oh,
With
I get it. I get
me,
it.
it's usually always sinuses.
Yeah.
What
I
was I
take
going to
allergy meds
say?
every day. Anywho,
Right?
today, what are we doing today,
Oh,
boss?
I was going to do the coffee thing. For
Oh,
those of you who
God.
like coffee as much as I do, of course, head over to Found Familiar. My affiliate link is now in chat. Use WH Pubs for 10% off. That was my spiel for today. I'm going to be mostly quiet now. But we're talking about the Ganjus Forest and the Haggard Hills today and all of the little bits around them. So let's start with. I guess we'll actually start with Amalthea because
Oh, the mouth, yeah.
it's like the little part right between the Kelder and the Ganjus that is our
Yeah,
segue
because
between the two from last
it's
week
in
and this week.
our tour of Ghelspad, where we were like do 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 do, and then we did this giant leap, and then we went do 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 do, and then we went. I can't move my arm, and then we went do 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 do, and then we went back, and then we went back over here, and then we went over here, and then we wandered around here for like 3 episodes, and then we went up here, and then we were like do do do, and then we went over here, and then we went and then we were like blah 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 blah, and then we went up here, and then we went all the way up here, and then we went down here, and now we're in Amalthean. It's a really long jog.
That sounds about right. And I mean, we're on episode like 35 or something. So that
I
sounds,
don't
I
know. I
mean,
lost track.
it's been quite the journey so far. And there's
Yeah.
still so far to go.
There's still so far to go. We haven't even touched the ocean yet. Barely. Anyway, so Amalthea. So yeah. And we've done more than just the tour of the tour of Ghelspad too. But anyway, yeah, Amalthea. So Amalthea. So we talked last time about Antanazu and how kind of Amaltheans came and moved in there and stuff like that. So like, who the hell are the Amaltheans? Today, they're something different than what they used to be, as is the case so much because of the Divine War. Long ago, and I don't know how long, Amalthea was the capital of a vast empire of peace and wisdom. The next question I have is the empire of what? Which empire wasn't the capital of the Lydian Empire? That was over here. It wasn't the capital of the Empire of the Flame. That was down here. Sure as heck wasn't the capital of the Sloracian Empire, unless it was. But I don't think so. And it wasn't the capital of the Snake People or the Elves or the. Anyway, I don't know what empire it was the capital of, but it was an empire of peace and wisdom. So it was, or at least historically, at least as they remember. It was a place of learning, that's for sure, and arts and stuff, and architecture and cool things, and they know that because there's a museum, and that's what the museum told them. Nobody really did. But in any case, vast empire or something, and as empires are wont to do, certainly as the Lydian Empire did, it eventually fell to stagnation and corruption and meh, till finally it was down to the little city-state of, basically city-state of Amalthea and the immediate areas, running as far south as Antanazu, which wasn't the Canyon of Souls yet, because Inkili hadn't built it yet, and but the Ganges was there, so it was just that. And the empire was on its death throes, as empires are wont to do. And as it was falling apart, a pair of lovers, kept the culture alive by creating a new government that worshipped Denev. This is again in the history books of Amalthea. They cleansed the city of evil and of the corruption and built a hub of culture and art. So this is what their legends say. What empire? Who were these lovers? I have no idea. But in any case, they were basically that until the Divine War. So it was just sort of this really nice, jazzy place. Not very big, like I said. It basically just this sort of region between, and including Antanazu at the time, Antanazu up to the edge of the Bleak Savannah, which wasn't the Bleak Savannah yet. It was just the savannah, and to the Ganjus and the Keldars, and it was just sort of this strip here in this region. And then the Divine War happened, and everything went to shit, because everything went to shit. And a lot of refugees fleeing from various other places that were just having bad things, horrible things happen, fled to this region, because this region was still getting stomped on, but not as much as some of the other regions, and known for nice people. And particularly refugees who were followers of Denev would go there and be like, "Can we come in? Because the elves won't let us in." And they're like, "Sure." And some refugees tried to come in. But then they got there and found that the people they were expecting to find were just not there. And the city, which was a pretty big city, was basically empty. And these refugees are like, "Where the hell did everybody go? We were coming in and they're not here, and what's going on?" And they searched for apparently like a week, trying to find the hundreds of thousands, or at least tens of thousands of people who were supposed to live in the city. And finally, they got into the University of Arts, which was this really, one of the many universities in Ghelspad. This was one of the more ancient ones. And they broke into the university and found several thousand of the citizens there cowering in terror, hiding in the university, and who had been hiding there for several weeks, long before the refugees apparently made it there. And they were like, "What happened, you guys? Why are you hiding? Was there Titan spawn? Did a Titan come through here? What happened? Why are you so freaked out?" And the people were so scared they couldn't even describe why they were hiding. They were like so freaked out. And so the refugees were like, "We'll help you. Like, we came for you to help us, but we'll help you." And they sort of kind of tried to help these poor citizens. And a lot of them went mad. And the rest of them couldn't even describe what it was that had freaked them out so much. They searched the rest of the city. They didn't find any bodies. They didn't find any evidence. They didn't find any Titan footprints. There was no other sign of what it was that freaked everybody out. But the refugees were like, "We'll stay anyway. It's still safer here, maybe," assuming whatever freaked you out doesn't come back. And they attempted to revive the city. And more refugees came, because, like you do, it was still, the Divine War was still going on. More refugees showed up and bolstered the population. And the only stipulation the folks there made was, you got to worship Denev, because we're sort of big on that. And everybody's like, "Okay, that's fine. We don't mind. She's on the side of the gods. We're good with that." And yeah, there was that. But the University of Arts that the people had hidden in, they kind of left it empty. They were like, "We're not going back there." And everybody's like, "Okay." And everything was okay. They sort of rebuilt it after the war and repopulated, and the population got up to, it didn't fill the city again, but it was still doing pretty healthy. It was a pretty good place to live post-war, and went on for good 50, 60, 70 years that way. Then the bad thing happened. And remember, a couple episodes ago we talked about the cannibals at Ket and the horrible Mormites who were like, "We're going to kill everything that has anything to do with Denev, because she killed our goddess and our Titan, and we really hate her and everything about her." And they sieged, they went and attacked the Ganjus, the big siege around the Ganjus. Well, given that they were also big into just killing any followers of Denev, they also went after Amalthea during this, because that was a big Denev area. Not the elves, but still Denev followers, and they didn't really care what species or race you were. You follow Denev, we want to kill you. So they went after, so, several years into the Druid War, they're like, we can't get in the Ganjus, we're going to go for these guys over at the east. And the Venomous Brotherhood and the Company of the Fallen Fang, because we have to give them wonderful, creepy names, were the specific cannibal groups who went after Amalthea. The walls were very strong, and they honestly should have been able to fight them off, because Amalthea was built incredibly well. But they were still underpopulated, because even though a bunch of refugees had come in during the war, it was still not to the numbers that they were at in the heydays of hundreds of years before. But their allies had come to help, and we'll talk about the Convention of Eritrea in a little bit, but basically that they had allies from, well, the elves were busy fighting their own siege, but they had help from Calastia, of all places, and Kila had sent troops, saying, okay, yeah, we'll bolster your numbers. But then, and they were ready. They were like, okay, they're coming and all of that business. But then, just before the cannibals showed up in Amalthea, Verdant withdrew the troops, and he's like, I gotta go kill my dad and take over the empire. So peace out, bye. And he basically withdrew his army and attacked Inkila. And Inkila were like, we were gonna help you, but now he's attacking us because we're not home, so we gotta go. We're sorry. We don't mean to, but we gotta leave. And they ran and they left. And although they didn't send as many people as Calastia in any case, so they left to go defend their own country from the Calastians. So that happened at the same time. And Amalthea's walls were overrun. And fighting was in the streets, and they were really screwed at that point. And tens of thousands died against the cannibals who were just running rampant through the streets. And again, they retreated back to that University of Arts that they really didn't like going into for some reason. And they retreated back there as the last line of defense. And just in the nick of time, which given how many tens of thousands died, I wouldn't actually describe as the nick of time, but at least before everybody was dead, the Vestian army and I believe the Albadians and Vera-Tre elves finally showed up. They wasn't that they weren't planning to, it just took a while. They showed up and managed to the last few people and managed to at least save the folks who were hiding in the university. So after several tens of thousands of people who'd been living in the city, we're now just to a couple of thousand people left alive. Really sad story. And to the point where even the Hollow Legionnaires, the Hollow Knights had sent in forces as well, and they were part of that last battle, kicking out the cannibals. And they got there so late that it was kind of too late by the time they arrived. And they felt so bad about it that they built a city based on Amalthean design. I think we talked about that when we did so we've talked about Amalthean in other episodes a little bit here and there. It's kind of a central influence in a lot of this region. So those who survived basically were like, well, that was terrible. But whether they were direct descendants of the old Amaltheans or descendants of various refugees who moved in over the decades, they all still had a sense of purpose. They all really believed in what this city was about and what the country that was a part of was about, and not just of Denev, but just of the culture and the art and everything around that was just so important to them that they were like, we're going to stay and we're going to try to rebuild it. But we don't know how, because no one remembers. And we don't even speak the old language anymore because it'd been so long and so many things had happened that just over decades of just trying to survive. So they built this little town right outside the walls of the city. Built a new wall around that they knew how to make around the town. And basically the rear end of the town goes into the city. But the city is just these old ruins now. But it's kind of neat. They keep it really, they take care of it. They kind of maintain this city really well. They cleaned it out of, during all the battles with the cannibals. They, buried all the bodies and cleaned everything up, cleaned up the streets, but they don't live in the city anymore. They want to rebuild it. There were all these palaces and beautiful gardens and mansions and architecture, and all this stuff was just totally trashed by the cannibals. And they were like, okay, we want to clean it up, but they didn't know how to rebuild these mansions because it was some old architectural lore. So they basically since the Druid War, which was in about 60 years ago in terms of the current timeline of Ghelspad in AB 150, they've just been doing research to figure out how to fix things and fixing little here and there, but not having the full lore of how to do these just giant architectural wonders that this old civilization had created. And they just sort of keep it clean. Like, okay, like some animals have moved into some of the old buildings, and they're like, well, they're okay. We'll keep them out of the streets. We'll sweep things up. We'll, make sure the garden, trim the lawn, whatever it is. But we can't. It's a huge city. There's only a few thousand of us. We'll do what we can. And a lot of outsiders would come to Amalthea for various reasons and be like, why are you guys staying? I mean, you could either move back into the city and just not worry about making it like it used to be, like they would do in Shelzar, or you could leave and go to some place that's maybe a little more prosperous, a little easier to live in, like, Desh or something. And they'd ask these questions of the people, and they'd just be like, I don't want to get the exact quote because it's just so lovely. They'd be like, because we have to. It's in honor of the people who died, or in some cases, I don't know why. And they just did. Not really knowing why they have to stay, why they have to make it beautiful. But they try. And they're also kind of working on, as I said, it's all about Denev as well. So all about celebrating the Titaness and everything around that, and around things that she would inspire as like the true neutral, not god, but the true neutral deity of Skarn. It's very much in that vibe of live and let live. They're not politically good, they're not evil, they're not lawful, they're not chaotic, they're kind of very, very neutral vibe people in Amalthea. Very balanced. They've been very close to nature as well, although not quite the same way the Druids and Elves are. So it's like the urban true neutral people. In so much as this little town of 8,000 remaining people. But Amalthea has some secrets, which is neat. For one, there is this thing called Denev's Heart, which kind of explains it of the thing, and it's it's mentioned in both new lore and old lore books. Two things called Denev's Heart, actually. One we'll get to in a bit, which is a location in the Ganjus. But the one that has to do with Amalthea is apparently an artifact, as far as we can tell. But is it literally her heart? The new lore says it's a giant ruby. The old lore doesn't specify exactly what it's made out of, but it implies it's an artifact, not a like Kadam's heart ripped out of his chest, but not like that. But something that Denev has influenced and blessed in some way. And the way it works is when this artifact is put somewhere, the region that is around it is blessed by Denev and becomes very, very verdant and very peaceful. And it heals the land that it's around. And for every year that it's there, that healing goes out like a mile in radius, and getting larger and larger. And everyone living in that region, literally their alignments shift to neutral if they're there long enough. If they're there for about 4 years, they start to really feel the vibe. And it's likely that this artifact is what makes the people who live there want to stay, want to rebuild Amalthea, want to live these values. And why they're like, I don't know why. It's probably this artifact that's messing with your head. But they also don't seem to mind. Now, if say someone who's has other purpose, or who's very has a minded of other ways, like say a paladin showed up, or a evil warlock showed up, and they were like, they just find Amalthea kind of yucky and want to leave quickly before it started to influence them, but they'd probably be aware of the influence because they have another counter influence that's just as heavy, at least on them, because as a paladin you've got a sense of purpose, or as a warlock to some patron, you probably have a sense of purpose. So if you're going in with whatever classic cleric, whatever it is, you're going in with a pre-existing sense of purpose, you're unlikely to be affected by Denev's heart or whatever it is that's affecting Amalthea. But the longer you stay, the longer you want to stay, and the easier it is for you to be influenced this and sort of join the general populace. And amazing as that is, the populace, though, still hasn't gotten very much larger. It's still, at this point, maybe 150 is about 8,000 people, which overall is pretty small. Let's see. One other cool lore thing about the region around it, not specifically the town, but the mountains nearby, there is a group of druids who live nearby. Yeah, they are almost certainly influenced by the heart as well, because they live in the mountains nearby. Specifically druids of Denev. And they heard these rare Amalthean rams. I think they're goats. Rams I thought were sheep, but they described them as goats in some of the lore, so this one's a bit confusing to me. But in any case, there's a couple. They're mentioned mostly in the old lore, the Order of the Ram, and they protect these herd animals. And many of them, after the animals die, they take their horns and make these fancy headdresses out of them, which are basically these magical headdress things, which give them all sorts of funky abilities, and let them do like charge attacks and things like that, and headbutts. But also, the animals themselves are magical. Again, possibly influenced by that heart, maybe. But the milk from these ewes, so they say ewes, which makes me think of sheep, but they call them goats. So are girl goats ewes? I don't know. Anyway, their milk is magical, and they use it. It's basically like a healing potion, equivalent in terms of what it can do, plus cure disease and cure like some other things. So it's like a healing potion on steroids. And they're really, really rare. Basically, these special little animals, and these druids protect them and make sure no one else outside exploits them, because everybody wants one, because they're like magical healing animals, and who the heck doesn't want healing milk? I can't imagine that the cheese is like, what Amalthean cheese? I don't know. I have pizza made from Amalthean animals. Anyway, so that's another kind of fun little thing in that region. Let's see, what did I skip? The people themselves, there's a little bit of contradictory here. Pure Amalthean blood is super rare. Even of the people who live there, and again, the population's so tiny, it's like 1% of the population of 8,000 people, and that tiny percent as we talked about, in Antanazu are of Amalthean descent. So it's not considered one of the major ethnicities of humans in Ghelspad. We talk about like big four ethnicities. This not even makes the map. But they are described as, and I think we talked about what they look like last week. Dark skin, straight dark hair, high cheekbones, strong jawline, straight nose, tall and muscular. But very, very few pure or even half-bloods remain, because they've pretty much interbred with Veshian people or possibly with some of the Albanian people. And they pretty much focus on all things Denev. Denev's big holidays throughout the year. One neat one I thought was pretty cool, which gave me a little hint about something else. They celebrate Denev's Day holiday every year. And prior to the Divine War, it happened at harvest season. But they're still tracking with the old Amalthean calendar, which presumably they got from the university, that they still use. They don't live in it, but they do research out of it. And every year in the AV calendar, the holiday is 2 weeks later than the previous year, which gives us a clue. This is one of the only clues I've found of how long the year was before the Divine War and the gods organized the calendar and made everything all smooth and shiny and 400 days long, which implies that, assuming that 2 weeks, they still think a week is 8 days on the new calendar, using the new calendar week length, that the OC calendar would have been 416 days long. So that's interesting. I always use 365 just because of, Earth simplicity, but maybe it was 416 days long. And this little piece of jot of lore, one little tiny snippet in one paragraph in one book implying how long the calendar used to be. This is the kind of deep shit you do when you're reading Scarland's books. But based on that, it would take about 25 years for the Denev's Day celebration to go around the whole calendar, which sometimes it happens during the winter time or during the spring, even though it's supposed to be a harvest festival. That'll be confusing. But this festival's a really big deal. They go and dress in old Amalthean. There's a picture of our lady in the big feathers is supposed to be wearing a Amalthean headdress that they found in these old libraries because they're still celebrating this ancient culture that none of them remember and that most of them aren't even descendants of. So they would dress like this and all of this business. And I think that's neat. The population is not just humans, though. A lot of elves have moved in, as well as a scattering of other races. The majority of the population are humans and elves. Lots of druids live there, no question of that. And I think because of Denev influence, things like crime is super rare, and just everybody kind of jams to the same vibe because of all of that. It's really no surprise. And there's so much focus in all of this old culture that they're still trying to revive, and all this old technology, sort of science and whatnot, not really science, but you know what I mean, that they go into the city, they will find books out of the library, bring them in, read them, and put them back, but it's like everything stays in this place. And so they've got the old university, but they've also built a museum in the old city, that they've just taken everything that they could get their hands on that survived the various battles and moved at them and tried to rebuild what they could, or at least put it on pillars and plinths and things and labeled it and said, we think this is this. And there's just one of the buildings that was in the old city, they've turned into a museum. And tourists, seriously, people from across Ghelspad actually go here and learn about it. And you can request a tour of the old city if you're say a sage or a bard or something from another country, and they'll take you through the city. They generally don't let you in the university because, again, that's we don't go there. They don't really say why. I think that's probably where the heart is hidden. It's a hunch. But they'll take people through the city. But it's very well guarded, so you have to get a tour guide, because they've also set up traps around both the city itself to keep out Ketan invaders and Titan spawn or whoever was gonna make trouble. And they've set up illusions around the actual university, so good luck getting in. So it's basically take the tour guide with you, and they'll be don't step there, it's a wire trap. Okay, we'll go this way. And keep you safe as they take tours of the old city. But the old city is locked most of the day, most of the time, certainly at night, and there's 24-hour patrols all the time, where a good eighth of the town is trained to patrol the city, and there's always guards there, always on alert, because of how interested the Ketians are in getting in, and presumably to steal the heart. And I remember Ilkatstra we talked about a few episodes ago, that the oh so nasty Autumn King. The story goes that he looks to seek, and this is a new lore, so one of his mentions in the SLPG, that he seeks Denev's heart and plans to corrupt it, and then the artifact, corrupt it, and then send it into the Ganjus to corrupt Denev herself, so that she can like inhabit the spirit of Mormo and bring Mormo back. I don't think that's the entirety of his plan. I suspect it would be more complicated than that, but they do simplify things in the new SLPG. But it does map his MO, certainly. It is very much Il-Custhra thing to do something like that. But that could be why the cannibals attacked Amalthean, to get Denev's heart, because presumably it was already there. My guess is it showed up post-war. Was its placement there what freaked everybody out? What made people disappear? We don't know. It's a mystery. Would be a fun game, I think. Alright. Did I miss anything about Amalthea? That was a lot.
No, but I'm going to throw in, so thanks to Alan who's watching, I did find, he linked that map. Ooh. So there's a map that was put up on the Old Swords and Sorcery, who used to publish Guardlands. Their website had a map. And so that's up on the screen right now. And essentially number 4 there is what was called the Amalthean province during the Libyan Empire.
Oh, yeah.
And essentially it's Antanazu. Like a lot of that area that is, it's a little larger than Antanazu is now, but like both sides of the Kelder, that the canyon, which wasn't there at the time.
I think by the Libyan Empire it might have been there.
Okay.
I was saying it wasn't there in the if the empire that Amalthea was the capital of was pre-Lydian.
Right. Yeah. So it's
then Keely wouldn't have been born yet, so he couldn't have made the canyon. Or they couldn't have made the canyon. So
the canyon's on the map, but that's whether or not was it lazy on the map maker side that they're just like, we're gonna circle where it was. It doesn't matter.
Well, they're just using the Ghelspad map.
Exist? Right.
Yeah, they're using the modern Ghelspad map and just circling the areas of approximately where those those provinces of the Lydian Empire would have been.
So definitely, I wouldn't say it was ever. It's a good amount of land, but was it an empire in the way that the Asafi Empire was an empire, or the Lydian Empire was an empire? Not so much. It didn't have its own empire that size.
Well, this was when it was part of the Lydian Empire as a province, because it was one of the dozen or so, or 9, or however many provinces there were in the Lydian Empire, and I kind of glossed over those very roughly when we did the Perforated Plains. But yeah, it was one of the many, but the provinces that covered the bulk of Ghelspad, minus like the Ganjus and the Yakutan Desert and the swamps of Kentet, but the bulk of the rest of Ghelspad was part of the Lydian Empire, so this was one of the many provinces. So think of it as like a big state. So I think that this map is describing where all those provinces were. I suspect the Amalthean Empire, given that it was supposed to be a capital of an empire, that would have been a pre-Lydian Empire. That's why I was saying I don't know what empire they're talking about.
Right.
It certainly wasn't the capital of the Lydian Empire. Was it the capital of the Amalthean province of the Lydian Empire? Well, yeah, that makes sense. Is that what they mean? I don't think so, because of the description. Are they saying that post-Lydian, the fall of the Lydian Empire, when it went independent? Maybe that's what they're talking about. Maybe. That's certainly a possibility. It wouldn't be that ancient, but it'd still be several hundred years. Because that would have, several hundred years in any case. Because in the final 2 dynasties of the Lydian Empire, all of the other provinces pretty much declared independence, and Amalthea left around the same time that Vesh did. And then Vesh was like, we're going to be a bunch of little kingdoms, and then we're going to unify as one big kingdom. And then Amalthea was like, we're just going to be here and be our little thing. So maybe that's what they mean. Maybe that's when it was, quote, an empire. It doesn't feel like an empire to me at that point, but I don't know. Also, multiple authors wrote this book, so there you go. As we know from experience how that business works. But yeah, I think I've seen this map before. All right. Anything else about? Otherwise, I'm going to move on. Continuing to the west, to the Ganjus. which is Lore of the Ganjus made me crack open the book of the Scarred Lands that is, to me, the most cursed book of the Scarred Lands original 40 some odd books. Because I would have been remiss if I have done this section without delving into the history of the elves, which meant cracking open the Forsworn and the Forsaken, which I have like a bad experience with because it's a very confusing book. And I kind of dove into the madness that is that book that I will talk about in more detail in a future episode when we get to Termana. But I wanted to at least address how long the elves have been in the Ganjus and where they originated. Because the Ganjus to me is, if you ever read the Silmarillion, and now I'm flaking on the name of Doriath, I think it was what it was called, or something along those lines. There's this hidden forest in the middle of the land where everything in the Silmarillion takes place, where a bunch of elves lived and did magic and didn't let people in. And I think that influenced the writing of the way the Ganjus worked. The elves have been around forever. I mean, not forever. They weren't around during the Epoch of Kadam, but they've been around just about as long as any other people. The first Empire of Ghelspad that really happened, which we talked about several episodes ago, which was the Asathi, talks about the elves. The elves didn't control Ghelspad, but it's clear that there were elves in the Ganjus as long ago as the Asathi Empire. They had their own empire, their own lands that they called Therathos. The Forsworn and the Forsaken goes back further than that, but the dates of that are fuzzy at best, and it's very falls under mythology that there was all these elven dynasties before the Empire of the Rose, or Therathos. What they say of Therathos is described as abutted the vast Asathi Empire to the north, which was called the Empire of the Lotus, and the minor between the Asathi Empire of the north and the minor states of Termana. Termana and the Asathi Empire were on different continents. Termana is another continent. Asathi Empire was all in Ghelspad. Asathi didn't really have had some trade with Termana, but didn't have any, as far as I know, any colonies there. So between the two, and we know the Asathi Empire went all the way to the south shore of what is Ghelspad today. So between the two was the elves. And I was like, between the two is ocean. Lots of ocean. Not so much place. They weren't sea elves. They were land elves. Elves. But the old lore also stipulates that the Theros was sunk beneath the waters of the Cerulean and blossoming seas as a result of a war, a really horrible war, with the Asathi, called the Ballad of Lotus and Rose. Empire of the Lotus, Empire of the Rose. Talks about it in more detail, apparently. It's a famous elven story. And we can go into more of this later when we talk about the High Elves of Termana when we event someday, if we ever get to Termana. But there was this horrible war between the two races. It's triggered by basically a battle over resources, and the elven patrons were like, "Don't do this," and they were like, "We're gonna do it. We want to," and they fought. And several of the elven groups were like, "We want nothing to do with this war." And one group had gone into these underground areas that were left behind by the Slaracians, by the old Slaracian Empire, and inhabited that, and they became the Derdrindal. And another group lived in the Ganjus, were just like the elves that had set up community there. And they were like, we want nothing to do with your war with the Asathi. This is madness. This is just a really bad idea. This is going to destroy both civilizations. We want nothing to do with it. And so they basically bugged out. And they were like, we don't want to follow your weird stuff and your philosophies anymore. We want to be one with the land. We are going to follow Denev from now on. And they broke off with the Empire. And that's with kind of the start of the Ganjus elves worshipping Denev solely. Prior to that, the elves, their first patron was Mesos, the Titan of magic, and they're in the lore, in the deep mythology of the creation of the elves. He's mentioned. So if it, despite the Ganjus elves being fervent followers of Denev, that implies to me that Mesos may have been the Titan that created the elves, but it's not clear. It's left vague, which is fine. So they kind of had that splinter, but the elves were clearly in the Ganjus from well before that splinter happened. They just at that point kind of were like, we're doing our own thing now, and we're not going to be part of the Empire anymore. But the Ganjus himself was named, I think, implied through a bit of research, was named after a dragon. Amongst the elves were also one of their other patrons, in addition to Mesos and the elven god. They also had a close partnership with the dragons of old, and this is again earlier days of the Elven Empire. To the point where they intermarried and bred with dragons, which was really cool. And I want to get the name right. One of the dragons was named first dragon to marry an elf, or I should say first dragon prince, first dragon ruler, not necessarily the first dragon, but the first dragon ruler to marry an elven ruler was named Ganju, Ganju. So my theory is that the Ganjus was named after him, since it's just, sticking an S at the end. So, but this lore comes from the Forsworn and Forsaken, which was second to last Guardlands book written back in the heyday of Guardlands books, and contradicts buckets of stuff from the earlier books, which is why I find this book so challenging. So everything from this book I take with a whole giant pillar of salt, not just a grain. Because it was like massive whiplash of lore changes. And not necessarily stuff that they've continued with in the new lore for the 5e/Pathfinder books either. So was the Ganjus named after a dragon that married an elf? Maybe. We'll just leave it at that. Anyway, enough for the ancient history of the elves. So they've lived in the Ganjus a really long time, and that was the split was way before the Divine War, way before the Lydian Empire, way before the Empire of the Flame. Right at the end of the old Asathi Empire, which was before the Ice Age. So look at that. So consider that. Now, how did the elves of the Ganjus get through the Ice Age? I don't know. Doesn't say. But they were certainly there by the time the Ice Age was over, and were there throughout like those other major empires. And when the Lydian Empire spread across, as we just said, just showed the provinces, the Ganjus, they were like, we want you to be in our empire. And the elves were like, no. And then they're like, no, we do. We'll send in armies. And the elves were like, yeah, no. And they really couldn't get past. Like, the elves would just not let them in. And it was not going to happen till finally one of the smarter empires just declared it the Ganjus Protectorate of the Lydian Empire, which was a way to saying, They're part of the Lydian Empire, but they're independent, and they get to do their own rules and their own laws and their own government and their own trade routes and their own pretty much everything. But they're completely surrounded by the Lydian Empire, and they'll have to deal with us if they want to do anything outside of it. And the elves were like, fine, whatever. We won't argue with that. We don't care. It's your paperwork. We're still doing our own thing. And insofar as the Ganjus and Vera-Tre was part of the Lydian Empire, they were a protector. Which really didn't mean much, because they didn't really need the help of the Empire, because the elves historically were always really badass. And very, very, very independent for a very long time. When finally the Divine War heated up, they really didn't want to get involved in the war. And it wasn't until Denev, because the first few incidents of Divine War, Denev wasn't involved, because Denev wasn't involved when they took out Mesos, and wasn't involved in the first when they took down the first couple of other Titans after Mesos. And while she was like, I'm not going to stand against you, she didn't start fighting with the gods until they started going after the Titans she really hated, Gorak and Mormo. And it wasn't, I think, just Gorak and Mormo, the two she really got involved in. So the elves were like, what do we do? And she's like, guard the Ganjus. Your job is fight any Titans that don't leave the gods alone. They won't bug you. Fight any Titans that come near the Ganjus. Protect it. And they're like, we can do that. And they basically held the Ganjus, which got attacked time and time again by Titans and Titanspawn, mostly Titanspawn, throughout the years of the war. And they did a really good job. I'd say magic / technology of the Elves of the Ganjus is certainly never up to the level of the Empire of the Rose. They are, they didn't work with dragons anymore. They didn't have dragon-blooded elves, at least not for. It was by that point so thinned out. If there was any, they didn't have these high magics that the Termanan elves are known for. But they're still incredibly badass, and one thing that they discovered in the Divine War is if you try to go into the Ganjus, the trees will fight you. And they can literally create these rituals that cause the entire forest to rise up and kick your ass. So the Ganjus elves are a force to be reckoned with, in the least. And there's a reason why the Ketinas never broke the border. They get into the woods, but they never get as far as Vera-Tre. So that's kind of that bulky history. Let's see. The population of the Ganjus is, in old lore, it was 100% elves. In new lore, it's probably closer to 90% elves, because they do allow, like, with the whole heritage thing, you could be other presumably adopted races that got brought up in the Elven society, but being a non-elf would still be incredibly rare. So I imagine it's still 90-95% Elven in the Ganjus, at least in the heart of the forest. There are other cultures that are kind of in the border areas, but certainly in Vera-Tre, estimated between 100 and 200,000 elves in the region. Did we talk about incarnates much? I cannot recall if we talked about incarnates in previous episodes. But the idea is, with incarnates, are a special kind of druid, or, well, a special kind of someone. Prior to the gods, all spirits were reincarnated once gone. So you died, and if you didn't end up like a ghost somewhere, you were reborn as another thing and lived another lifetime, and just, over and over again. Recycling of spirits. And each lifetime, you might be a squirrel one life, and you might be a wolf, and then you might be a bird, and you might be an elf, and you might be a dwarf, and you might be a halfling, and it just varies. Incarnates are a special kind of druid, usually didn't have to be a druid in the old lore, but it helped. You did pretty much have to be true neutral, or some kind of neutral. And they eventually remember their past lives. So, and if you're of a druid type, they can turn into those past lives. And in the way that Druids do the wild shape thing, where it's like, I'm gonna go be a wolf and fight like a wolf or whatever, and you can turn into various beasts as a Druid, both in the old and the current editions of D&D. Incarnates, when they turn into a beast, they turn into a beast that their spirit used to be in a former life. So when you turn into a wolf as an incarnate, you're just not turning into a wolf. You're turning into a particular wolf that you have memories being. And every time you turn into a wolf, you're that wolf. Unless you were multiple wolves in your past lives, then you're one of those wolves. Because these incarnates are also generally very old souls. And given that people with souls have been on Skarn for presumably millions of years, these souls could have lived hundreds and thousands of lifetimes. Do incarnates remember every single lifetime they lived? Probably not. I expect many were boring. But they kind of get that sense of the ones that were really important over time. Basically, as you go up in level, you remember more lifetimes, you can change into more things. So, and even the things you can't change into, you kind of have memories of what it was like to be them. And you know, in the rule sets, it's like you get more skill bonuses, but you know, it varies. But it's just a neat concept of like, oh, you can remember all of this. The rulers of the elves and the Ganjus are very particular in that not only are they incarnates, but they're one of 4 people always. And it's like the Dalai Lama, except there's 4 of them instead of 1. And every time one dies, a search begins to find where they're going to get reincarnated. And they were the original 4, what they called them, the 4 eldest beasts. You know, in the early days of presumably the Ixoc of Gormoth or Gulfane, one of those guys, the animals were first made. These were like the first of these particular species of animals. The first hawk, the first wolf, the first stag, and the first bear. Reincarnated over and over again, and eventually those 4 spirits became the rulers of the elves of the Ganjus. So and they have names too, and so the current ruler is one of these. I can't remember which of the 4 he actually is, but so it kind of goes back to that, which I think was really neat. It's like, ooh, it's like they remember. The only thing that concerns me about that is, does that mean their culture is stagnant? Because if it's the same 4 people ruling, does it get kind of, you know, does elven culture advance at all? Because you don't have new blood, you don't have new ideas, because it's just the same 4 people over and over again. So that's kind of interesting. And with 4, it gives like one to give them time to find the next one and for them to grow up, you know. And then when one dies, the next oldest one will take over and whatever. So, and they're not all 4 necessarily alive at any one point or present or even known where they are, but they all are always elves, presumably. Although maybe some of the in-betweens, they get to be something else for a little while and then have to become an elf again to, I don't know how it works. They don't say. But that's a neat thing. Let's see. The capital of the capital is called Vera-Tre, which is, it's described as a city, and in terms of population, it's a city, but in terms of any kind of recognizable urban metropolis, it wouldn't look it. Certainly fits more of the Tolkien, Lothlorien / Wood Elves and whatnot ideas of a city. Although I think, again, much more like kind of some of the stuff in the Silmarillion vibe. Houses made from trees and completely blending in the environment, where, you know, windows or shutters or roots and things like that, and they, you know, you build a room out of a burrow in a side of a tree that you kind of build a room into, and all of those things. So you wouldn't realize you were in the city when you were in the city if you weren't like really one with nature and a druid going, hey, there's people living up in that tree or in that hedge or whatever. And not that they're necessarily trying to be camouflaged in Vera-Tre, just they're so close to nature that's how they live. Plenty of, so basically just a greater population there. Most elves in the Ganjus aren't, most of them are either druids or rangers or of that kind of class. Lots of bards, but you're not going to find metal clad fighters with catapults or whatever. They're not going to be like that. They're very we wear green and use wood things and natural things a lot and all of that kind of, just like you expect. Give your cliche elves, that's the wood elves of the Ganjus. And they're differentiated as wood elves versus the high elves in Termana, although in our lore we generally call them the Ganjus elves versus the Termanan elves versus the Derdrendal. But that whole traditional sense there. Again, I blame Tolkien for like 90% of this shit. Okay, let's see. It's not the capital. The Verdant seat is where the leader does his thing, which is this massive father tree kind of thing in the middle of the city. And that's where he or she rules from. And then there's a bunch of druidic groves throughout the city where various religious ceremonies to Denev take place. Incarnates will meditate in one of these groves to discover their previous incarnations, or spellcasters would go there to summon their familiars or animal companions or whatnot, or commune with the spirits of the forest in these sacred groves, and druids would do their thing. So there's a bunch of these kind of groves that are specific to specific purposes. Kind of real details of Vera-Tre. Let's see. Anybody who tries to go into the Ganjus who isn't formally invited is going to have a challenge, as the elves are pretty much guard all of the borders. And while some groups of people, particularly in the new lore, have kind of moved slightly into the forest and do a little bit of hunting along the borders, if you try to get into the kind of the heart of the woods, you'll wander in, find yourself waking up outside the borders, having been knocked unconscious by a bunch of elves and just physically moved. And if you keep trying it, you'll find yourself waking up somewhere across the continent with your memories erased, not really knowing what happened to you. They don't kill intruders unless they're obvious threats or monsters or whatever, or cannibals, but they do kind of very encourage you not to come in if you're not invited. And that has been the case forever up until AV 80. And that is because the elves of Vera-Tre did a kind of major unheard of event called I'm going to get it right, the Convention of Eritrea. And there's lots of mention of this in various lore books, quotes from it, treaties were made. Basically, the elves invited representatives from across mostly northeast Ghelspad, although not just, or eastern Ghelspad, I should say, because the Calastians were invited. Inkila was invited, who hadn't been conquered by Calastia yet. Vesh, Albadia, various other Amalthea representatives there, and various other. I'm just looking at the map to remind myself everybody who was invited, but all came for this big, basically convention/conference, where they were like, okay, we're gonna talk about how things are happening. So this was about 80 years after the Divine War was over, and they were like, we're gonna create a treaty, a pact. One person gets attacked, we go help them. We want trade agreements across these places. They're not going to fully open their borders, but they want to make things easier. So if Vesh and Vigils want to cross the Ganjus to go and do something over in the Haggard Hills or over in Derakeen, they get to the border and they ask for escort, and the elves will take them across the Ganjus. We'll escort them. So you're not given free reign, like you can't just wander around the forest, but we will bring you through. So no longer wait for the invite, come knock on our door, kind of a thing. And everybody's like, whoa, this has never happened. And all these people who'd never seen much of the Ganjus, because nobody was allowed in, suddenly were invited to the capital of Vera-Tre, and all these ambassadors were suddenly invited to the capital. I mean, never seen it before, and it was just like mind-blowing of this event. And I think Yugman was there. Like, it was a big deal. Interestingly, the people who were not invited or who didn't come, maybe got, like, nobody came from Derakeen, and nobody was invited from any of the, quote, Titan spawn civilizations. There may have been orcs, it's not clear, but there certainly wasn't Slytherin, tell you that. There wasn't any Asathi. New lore, old lore, was there Manticora? I think the new lore implies that the Manticora were invited, but obviously the Manticore civilization didn't even exist in the old lore, so that wasn't, mentioned in the old lore, obviously, because the older Manticore is just a weird, tiny group of people that were kind of horrible that no one dealt with. They weren't like a playable, not redeemed race. So they're fuzzy. And none of the sea-dwelling races or anything like that. But and a lot of the redeemed races were very snubbed by not getting invited. Like, how come you didn't invite the Asathi? Like, what's wrong with us? Well, you did kind of worship Mormo, who's been our enemy now forever, and most of you still do, and we're not cool with that. So no, you're not invited to our conference. Ditto for the Slytherin. No, not invited to our conference. We're redeemed. What's a redeemed? We've never heard of you. They made the excuse. They didn't know what a redeemed was. Then the new lore, that's what it says in any case. And everybody's like, wow, this is a big deal. And then, not a handful of years later, suddenly the Ganjus is attacked by a bunch of cannibals from Ket. And they call in all the allies. They just made it this conference just a couple years ago, and was that foretold? Did the elves have a vision of being attacked by the cannibals? And is that why they made this conference? Because they knew they were screwed if they didn't have allies? Coincidence? Or fate? But the result of it is the alliance still stands. So, it's kind of, thank you for helping us defend against the Ketinas in the Druid War. Yes, we will help you if you need to fight the Calastians or who whatnot, if something else comes up your way. So that's a cool thing. And you find, like I said, there's references to the Conference of Vera-Tre throughout many of the books. They'll be like, this is when everybody kind of met and talked and did things. Okay. They also introduced this concept called the Ganjus Concords, which was a legal system that they basically shared with various other groups of, this is how we do legal things in a true neutral society. And these legal concords carried over into other cultures. Amalthea in particular adopted the Ganjus Concords as their own base legal system, as well as various other kind of druid-like cultures throughout the region who were pretty, like the Elves of the Broad Reach Horizon, and various groups there. The basic tenets of that, they are generally tolerant of any and all behavior, even dishonesty, as long as it does no wasteful harm to living things. So hunting is okay, but hunting for sport is not okay. You're hunting for food. You have to use as much as you can of the things you hunt. You don't destroy trees to plant farmland, because that's wasteful. You build farmlands in existing areas where farms would fit. So things like that. And you find this belief system in Albadia, Amalthea, Antanazu, and in a few it's various rural halfling areas, and a few pockets in Vesh followed this kind of philosophy in terms of their legal system. So I think that's kind of a neat thing. And the elves also had their own calendar, the details of which, in terms of dates and stuff, again hinted at in the Forsworn and Forsaken book, but not so much in the other books. But it was broken up into cycles. Each cycle in the Ganjus elves, not necessarily the rest of the elves, but certainly the Ganjus elves, was named after a treant. That's one of those big, graybeard-like walking trees. And each cycle is broken down in 100 years, or each cycle is 100 years long, named after a specific treant who did something cool. So it'd be like the cycle of, name your giant walking tree. The cycle completely fell apart during the Divine War because years get kind of fuzzy during that era. So they basically started from scratch in AV1 because they're like, well, it was kind of the 87th day of the cycle, or 87th year of the cycle, but we're not sure. It might have been the 89th or the day. We don't know. We're just going to start over. So we're going with AV1 is going to be year one of this next 100-year cycle. First one post-war was named after one of the treants who led the defense of Denev against the forces of Mormo in battle. And the current cycle is named after the treant mentor of the current ruler of the elves and the Ganjus. So, and I'm not going to say their names because they're long and unpronounceable. They're really long. Like, trees have lots of consonants. Yeah. Okay. What am I missing? You've been so quiet, Jeremy. Just hearing my own voice.
Sorry, I've actually muted all my mics so no one had to listen to me sniffle and cough. So,
I did see you cough at one point.
Yeah. The only other thing that I have is the Jorday, which is the...
yeah, really important.
But I don't know if we want to do that during a secret society. They're not really secret, but they're not really well known either. So, why don't we do that during a secret society episode?
Just to sum up, since you mentioned them, they're a specific class. They're a group of druids who guard things for the Gans, and they're
called Oak Brothers or something. Hang on. Oak Brothers, but they're druids and rangers. Essentially, in 3rd edition, it was a prestige class, and you could go in and
still a prestige class in 5th edition, or
did they
not a prestige class? Not a prestige class. What do you call it? A archetype.
Gotcha.
Yeah, subclass. You can.
Yeah,
you can
so
play
it was a group that acts as
guardians
of the forest, but also I can't think of the word. Hang on, I'll look it up. They were
they see to the spiritual well-being of the forest.
Right. They were counselors for the
king,
the
ruler.
Coven Catol. I can't pronounce that word. The people who rule in the council in Vera-Tre.
Yeah. The Verdant Seat and his council, or
right,
council.
Verdant Seat.
Yeah. What's neat in 5th edition, I will mention this because I've seen a couple of folks play Jorday now. I've rolled a few up. And they, in 5th edition, really cool when you're a low-level druid, you get to have an awakened tree animal companion if you're playing Jorday, which you get at 2nd level. So you can have this tree walking around, basically this Christmas tree. It's about the size of a Christmas tree, just walking around. And when you're level 2, level 3, it is really handy to have this giant tree beating the shit out of things for you because it gets 2 attacks. Not as big of a deal once you're, tier 2, tier 3, but tier 1, really nice to have as a companion.
I'd like to see
bit more
someone do
badass than a badger.
I'd like to see someone do a ranger archetype, because it's a druid circle for 5th edition. I'd like to see, because in 3rd edition it was open to other classes, I'd like to see versions of it for other classes.
The Jordan, minimum rangers.
Especially because Ranger, I play rangers in 5th edition, and I'm okay with them, but they really could use some help. So doing a version for the rangers would be cool.
Yeah, the rangers are. Yeah,
sad.
Honestly,
they're sad.
Honestly, the only class to me that's terribly broken and badass in 5e is the rogue. I think every class could use a little help. Rogues and wizards are scary, but the rest of them, I do things for everybody except rogues and wizards are good. I don't think they need much more help. Okay, and there's some other small random groups in the area, but that's, I don't know. We could go into more, but this is not that much of a deep dive because I've got at least two other areas to cover. Heading south from the Ganjus, immediately south, is the Haggard Hills. Also, not just to the south, but to the south and to the west. The Haggard Hills borders this whole region around the Ganjus. So this thing between the Ganjus and the stricken forest is also the Haggard Hills. Basically, anywhere in here you see these bumpies. It's the Haggard Hills. And they serve as a wonderful natural border between the Ganjus and all the Yucklands. The Blood Steppes, the Hornsaw, the Stricken Forest, what we call the Yucklands, horrible places. All the beasties and monsters in those places. The Haggard Hills serves as a very nice border between them, and those who patrol it. The history of this region, get into in a bit, comes from it used to be called the Pyrian Hills. R-A-N, Pyran? We'll go with Pyran Hills, which both covered both the Haggard Hills and the Blood Steppes, and kind of between those two regions, or in those two regions, were the Pyran Hills, which is where the Halflings had massive communities prior to the Divine War. Most Halflings who weren't kind of scattered around various other communities, and you can find Halflings just about everywhere in Skarn. Like every continent has Halflings. Even the Dragonlance has Halflings. Like every continent has Halflings. But this was one of those areas that it was a Halfling-dominated, Halfling majority population. And very few of those exist today. But the Halflings were driven out during the Divine War because of a couple things that happened. Some bad stuff happened in the Blood Steppes, and we'll get to that in a bit. But first, some really bad stuff happened in the Haggard Hills. Some debate as to exactly which thing it was. But I've done a little bit of research and I think I've sussed it. So first thing that happened was also in the Pyrian Hills, there was a place called Valmatia. V-A-L-M-A-T-I-A-N. And there's multiple ways this is spelled in the lore too, which drives me nuts. But Valmatian, or Valmatia, city of Valmatia in the Pyrian Hills. It's referenced in a couple of obscure rando locations. Apparently a big wizard area, despite all the other freaking wizard areas throughout Ghelspad. This was yet another one. I also debate where exactly, because Alan and I actually debated this. Is it even in Ghelspad? But I'm, in retrospect, pretty sure it was in Ghelspad. As much as we wanted it to be in Asherak. Because it is part of the Pyrian Hills, and I think I have an explanation what the problem is. When the gods were preparing to go fight the war, they knew they were going to have to take out Mesos. They had this planned. And Madriel, the city of Valmatia was dedicated to Madriel, and she came to them and said, I need you to make a thing to fight Mesos. And do some research and figure it out. And they built this, or created, I should say, not really built, created this spell called a Mana Spear. You can look it up in the lore, but basically it screws up arcane magic. And there's a reference to this in the Ghelspad campaign setting book of the witness was an incarnate who at the time was a wizard familiar. We learned everything that ever happened in the history of Skarn based on what the incarnates remember. Memory is fallible. Said familiar said my master was working on this spell for Madriel, and when the gods attacked Mesos, they brought us there to the battle place. The incarnate assumed the battle place was near where they were coming from in Dalmatia. My proposal is, why would it have to have been anywhere near where they were coming from? Because a lot of the other theories, everything supports the idea that that attack of Mesos was in Asherak. My thought is, why didn't Mandriel just go pop and got all these guys with the mana spheres and immediately teleported them to Asherak and went, okay, throw your weapons at Mesos as we were taking him down? Because the other thing that happened is not a single one of these wizards survived the battle. And while all of the victor gods survived the battle, all of the mortals they brought in to fight it. And this is the only reference that they even brought mortals in to fight it, is the existence of this spell and the word of one incarnate who remembered being there as a familiar. The only two references that mortals were even at the battle. My thought is she probably just bamfed them to Asherak. They threw their mana spheres and then pretty much died in the explosion or whatever, or just in the fight, or Mesos killed them or whatever. Because none of them survived. So that's my reasoning, and it's a little headcanon of me, but also there is zero other evidence to indicate that Mesos was killed in Ghelspad. Never mind the Haggard Hills. Just a lot of like, was he? Where did he die? Rumor. Because it certainly wasn't what wrecked the Haggard Hills. That all comes down to one guy who is the source of so much crap. Like, in addition to, pissing on a bunch of Hollow Knight corpses and abandoning the Manticora and just being a dick all over, he also decided to destroy everything alive in these hills with one sweep of his sword or axe. Vangal just annihilated everything living in this region down to the bacteria level. And I am not exaggerating, because they actually talk about this. The fact that there is nothing alive, or was nothing alive in these hills after he struck. Like, destroyed everything. And the whole 100% of the blame is placed on Vangal there. The halflings, who were basically the only reasons any of the halflings who lived in that region survived, is because they had already evacuated, because by that point this was fairly late in the war, and there had been a bunch of battles in that region. They wanted to go home, but they were like, our home is gone, it is not inhabitable anymore. And that's why many of the halflings migrated to what eventually became the heteronomy of Verduk. They're down here, so then they lived up here, this region. And Dalmatia presumably fell as well, although it's not really talked about other than this. It's like, you think the ruins of Dalmatia would be somewhere in the Haggard Hills or Blood Steppes, and yet it's never mentioned again. So what is up with that? I don't know. It's one of those, like, all of these things happening in this region, and yet it's never mentioned again. So it's kind of the basics of what happened in the Haggard Hills. So again, though, this was 160-something years ago when Vangal did this. Since then, the elves at the Ganjus in particular, as well as some influence from Vesh and some other regions, were like, we've got to make this is a huge region. There's not a lot of places where people live. How can we reclaim it? And as we're healing, and all those people whose like mission is to reclaim Ghelspad, reclaim the earth, with Denev sleeping and healing everything. Oh, I forgot to talk about the healing circle. Shoot. Or not the healing circle. Forgot to talk about Denevs of their heart in the Ganjus, but I knew I'd forgot something, but that's okay. Center of the Ganjus is where Denev sleeps, and there's this place called, the other thing that's called Denev's heart in the Ganjus is where her actual resting place is. And they it's actually a location toward the end of the Serpent and Forest cycle that they go there and try to fuck with her. But sorry about that. Off the rails. You look so like out of it, Jeremy. So anyway, the Druids of the Ganjus were like, we want to rebuild, we want to reclaim the land. So they went to the edge of the Haggard Hills that borders the Ganjus, and they went out there and cast this ceremony. And I want to get the exact year on this. It wasn't too long after the war. They cast the first ceremony of I forgot what the name of the ceremony was called. My notes are kind of all staggered here. The something of the land. The restore the land ritual. There it is. I knew I'd find it. They went out to this valley right on the edge of the Ganjus and cast this massive ritual called Restore the Land, which basically seeded life back into the soil and back into the land. So prior to this ritual, there was just almost nothing alive. Like I said, a bacterial level of dead. On the borders, things were slowly starting to eke in, but it was hard for anything to set root there because the soil was just like not. There was no nutrients in it. It would rain and the water would just flood because there was no plant life. There's like ruins of towns, and it's also lots of, not to the extent of some of the other areas where there's undead, but lots of undead because like this huge thing killed everything, and then a bunch of people rose as undead, so a good chunk of undead in the area. Some scavengers for the first few years living off of the bones of what died, but not even bacteria, which means nobody rotted. So you'd find these bodies of the creatures and people and trees and whatnot died, and they're not decaying because there's nothing to feed on it. So just bleh. So anyway, Druids do this thing, and they start creating this region that they call the Healing Circle. And over the decades since that ritual, that region is now a 9-mile radius. So 18-mile diameter valley, Verdant Valley, and one of the nicest places in Ghelspad. And I'm kind of covering a lot of the nicest places in Ghelspad, as the Ganjus was one of the nicest places, and Amalthea is one of the nicest places, and the Healing Circle is all kind of the same region, right in the middle. The elves have been living there for quite some time now. The population is like 100% Denev worshippers, nearly 100% elves. We play with it a little bit in Vigilant. They actually go there on one of the plot points takes them to this little valley, and in it there's a town called Hope, where incarnates and druids live, and it's sort of the southern end of the valley, and they just kind of protect this little area, and they're starting to farm there. It's very new. They're just barely self-sustaining by AV 150. Just barely. Immigration is like almost non-existent because they're just barely self-sustaining. They can't afford more people coming in because the arable area is so tiny. As for the rest of the Haggard Hills, better than it was because it's been 150 years, but not that much better. In the new lore, they talk about small little towns with Manticora and a few other species have kind of grown up. Lots of brigands, criminal types have hideouts and caves in the hills and various places sheltered in valleys and things through the hills because no one goes there, so good place to have your smuggling cave or whatnot. So not a particularly safe region, but on the plus side, it's also not crawling with monsters because there's nothing for the monsters to live on either. So unless you're right at the southern border, if you keep heading south out of the Haggard Hills, you enter the really bad lands, and dead south is the Blood Steppes, which is arguably the worst, most dangerous place in all of Ghelspad. And just truly nasty. The named for the bloody battles that took place there, not really steppes, presumably used to be steppes, just in conjunction with the hills. Not really anymore. As the description of this region is just absolutely nuts. Steep rolling hills, weird rock formations, sharp crevices, chasms, geysers, sinkholes, and strange plant life. The chasms and crevices make mounted travel nearly impossible. That doesn't sound like steppes at all. Our argument when writing Vigilant was, which I love Fran's explanation for the Blood Steppes, is it used to be steppes, but anyone who went out there to go check to see if it was still steppes after the war didn't survive. So they just said that region we're calling the Blood Steppes. They just give the name Blood moniker to everything that was a major battlefield in the war. Blood Basin, Blood Sea, and it used to be steppes. We don't know what it is now because nobody goes out there to find out. And that's it got named the Blood Steppes. But as we also described, it looks like some giant colossal being took a pitchfork into the land and just sort of stirred. Because it's just so random and crazy. So, I don't know. But it is truly dangerous. Yes, there is life out there. Lots of life out there. And not as verdant as some of the other places like the Bloodbrain Woods or the Hornsaw Forest, but lots of things, mostly monsters. Biggest population, humans, primarily nasty ones who can survive it. Bat devils / Piterin, Manticora, Slytherin, and various giant races, various humanoid races, and rak dragons. This is one place on Skarn you're guaranteed to find a rak dragon. If you want to have a dragon fight, go to the Blood Steppes. There are several of them living there. The most prominent language in the Blood Steppes is Titan speech. So, population completely unknown in terms of numbers, but all sorts of things. Primary religions are Kadam, Gormoth, Thulkos, Vangal, and Velsamith. 2 Titans were defeated in this region. Thulkos, which this is where Corian took down Thulkos and beat him up and turned him into an arrow, which I don't know if it was he or Tanel shot into the sun. And during that battle, Thulkos sort of like bled molten metal on the land, which seeded it with rare metals and gold and iron and stuff. So mining, everybody wants to mine in the Blood Steppes if it wasn't so flippin' dangerous. So lots of gold deposits throughout the region, but very, very hard to get. Verdant, in fact, has sent expeditions out there, most of which don't return, to try to mine it. I think the dwarves, we had dwarves try to mine it in Vigilant, because it made sense, and of course they, it's not necessarily a happy ending for them either. Very dangerous area. So Thulkos was defeated there. There's rumor, once again, that this is where Gormoth the Writhing Lord is interred. Talked about him possibly being interred in the Titanstone Mountains. There's also rumors of him being interred in the Blood Steppes. Where's Gormoth? No one knows. There is, again, no giant chasm in the. There's small chasms in the blood, but there's no giant chasm in the blood steps that I think would be big enough to hold a titan of that scale. So I don't think he's in the blood steps either. But I've talked about my own theory about where Gormoth is. It said 2 titans were defeated there. I'm not sure which the other titan was that was defeated there. Maybe it was Gormoth. Maybe it was Hrinruk's body. Although I thought Hrinruk's body was like somewhere else. But they did talk about saying 2. But anyway, there was a lot. In addition to that, there was also just a lot of battles. That this was a very central area for armies to rampage through to get from one end of Ghelspad to the other, because nobody could go through the Ganjus. So lots of battles took place in this region. Lots of magic, lots of titans, blood and titan spawn, and it is certainly considered sacred ground to various titans in the region. Also kind of close to where Gulthaga made his end in the southern Keldar, and a lot of giants live in this region. So Kadim, a lot of followers of Kadim here too. So he made the giants, or some of the giants. So it's all crazy. Horsemen of Engel run through this region too. One of the many regions the Horsemen of Engel kind of love populating. So a lot of Vangal followers here. Geographically, there's some particularly interesting locations. There's these things called fangs, which not Gorak's teeth, as much as you think they would be, but just weird, or maybe they are Gorak's teeth, but there's these sharp spires of rock. They're followers of Gorak don't flock to them, which makes me think they're not Gorak's teeth. But they are some remnants of the war. Maybe it was like a spell that was like went nuts. They're not massively big. The biggest one is only a few 100 feet tall. I think the largest is maybe 500 or 700 feet tall. And most are more like 150, 200 feet tall. So they're big, mountain big, not colossal big. And in one, they're in Blood Fang, which is in the northwestern part of the Blood Steppes. There's a clan of Bat Devils, aka Pitterin. Pitterin's the redeemed name of the Bat Devils. Did we talk about the Bat Devils before? Yeah, we did, because there was Bat Devils on one of the islands off the west coast. So a bunch of Bat Devils lived there, and they moved in because there had already been several groups of dire bats living in this fang, which is why it was called the Blood Fang, because they were like vampire dire bats. I didn't know there were dire bats. Assuming there is some monster manual somewhere. So anyway, this thing had all these bats, so the Bat Devils were like, hey, we get along with bats, let's live there, and they moved in. So that's where kind of they have their thing. They're kind of weaker than most of the other weird monsters of the region, so they have a tough time of it. So they're there. Moving east of there is North Fang. So Blood Fang is kind of in the northwestern corner, kind of the northeastern corner is North Fang. That's about 150 feet high, under which there's a bunch of caves where one of the fire rack dragons lives. Fire rack dragons can't fly, unlike most other dragons, but they're still really dangerous and nothing to be trifled with. This particular fire rack dragon, who goes by do we have his name? I do not have his name. Okay. He has allied with one of those sad forsaken dwarves from Krigadam that we talked about, who left, but is still kind of nuts. And he basically allied with this fire rack dragon and has built for the dragon a classic dungeon underneath this mountain full of traps and constructs and beasties. So You want a classic dungeon with a dragon at the end of it? North Fang, Blood Steps. There you go. um, I'm sure there's a giant horde at the end of that. And then South Fang, which is southern end of Blood Steps, not far from the northern border of New Veneer, there is another fire rack dragon. This one is allied with Slytherin, which weren't specified in the lore, but we canonized as Brown Gorger worshippers of Gorak in that region because it was just fun to make them Gorak followers, honestly. So in my lore, in new lore, they're Brown Gorger Slytherin. Lore didn't specify, but in any case, they're Slytherin who basically don't necessarily work for the Rack Dragon, but are allied with it and work together in concert as they'll sort of drive food into his area and he'll let them eat the pickings, which is why I thought Brown Gorgers made sense. In other funky places of note, there's this chasm in the southeast region, rather close to the Hornsaw Forest, called the Cleft of Madness. If that doesn't sound kind of Lovecraftian to me, it certainly does. Where it's basically big chasm like you do. Is this where Gormoth is? Well, there's these ancient oak trees have grown across the chasm, creating kind of a funky bridge, which is how the Mormites use that frequently to get in and out of the blood, and out of the Hornsaw into the Blood Steps, and vice versa. But what's creepy about it is this wind runs through the area just because of the way it's structured, and makes these eerie wails, like insane screams, and then echoes to like these answering screams from the bottom of the chasm, which is it an echo, or is something down there just screaming back at the wind? Yeah, that's kind of creepy. And I believe that region also has various followers called the Twisted, which are spider-eye goblins and other Titan spawn cultists, including an Eton, who wander around the Blood Steps looking for Gormoth's body, and who have been found in that region looking for his corpse and not having found it. Is it a corpse? Technically he's still alive, even though he's like split in two, and so he's split in two and each half is encased on either end of on either side of a chasm, so, and unable to remerge, so he's technically still alive and just fucked up, and it sounds truly, truly horrible. Anyway, so could he be in the Cleft of Madness? I don't think so, but I would think the Twisted would have found him if he was. Another area, there's, as I mentioned briefly, there's these geysers, like, think Yellowstone, I guess? I don't know. And there is one Old Faithful type geyser in the Blood Steps called Thulkas's Ghost. Not literally Thulkas's Ghost, we know for sure he's on the sun, but they named it after him, and it's in the middle of a 3-mile wide region of geysers. And that particular geyser, that ghost, erupts regularly every day, exactly noon, when the sun has reached zenith over the steppes. I think it's called Thulkas's Ghost because Thulkas from the sun is influencing its eruption. Because why not? And yeah. And there's various hordes and clans and tribes rampaging all throughout this steppe land, fighting with each other and just causing all sorts of problems for anybody who actually tries to go through this region. There's several tribes of giants, the Broken Skull, who are Kadam worshippers, the Flayed Meat, who are also Kadam worshippers, who tend to fight with the Broken Skull because they do. The giant bloody hand. I love the names of these tribes. It's just totally horrible. These are giants who worship Vangal, and they actually have a fortress in the steppes. I don't know how they managed to build one, but they did. Giants, I guess, knew how to build things, and there you go. There's some barbarian hordes. There's the Demon's Wrath clan, a horde of human barbarians that run rampant across the steppes, all followers of Vangal, and just love kind of causing trouble. The Death Spirit tribe, who are Belsamites, led by a werejackal called the Eater of Souls. Love these horrible monsters. And let's see. And there's a group of red witches called the Red Moons. Red witches. That's a brood of Slytherin of the Rat Folk. She leads a cult of 13 red witches, more like a coven. They live kind of near the Hornsaw, and one of their big things is they've got sort of a horrible magic shop that various groups from the Hornsaw and Glividatel come to when they need magical tinctures and whatnot, and sacrificial victims for their horrible ceremonies, as this coven of red witches would go and just kidnap people in the region and then give them to necromancers and hags and whatnot living in the Hornsaw, going, oh, you need some sacrifice people, here's some, we found this village of people for you, here you go. So there's that. So yeah, so you're thinking, okay, we're just gonna go on the blood steppes and we're gonna go mine some of that gold, but Thulkas bled here. Good luck, guys, because you're gonna run into name the monster, and these are just some of the biggies. So, it's also just run rampant with everything from dire rats and dire weasels to hill howlers and various worm spawn things, and smaller rack dragons, less powerful rack dragons, and just horrible everythings through that region. But definitely Verdant. The line that I love is, how do you know when you've left the Haggard Hills and enter the Blood Steppes? It's when you turn around and run screaming, fleeing your way back to the Ganjus. Because holy shit. It is bad. We do go into some more details in Vigilant as the characters make their way through the Haggard Hills and the Blood Steppes. So in Vigilant, and come across some of these more horrific areas. Anyway, there's probably more, but we've been at this for a while, and I'm getting tired talking. So, is there anything I missed, Jeremy?
Pardon me while I unmute everything.
Yeah.
No, I think we've covered, or you've covered, a lot of the stuff that we need to do today.
Yeah. One thing you won't find is redeemed Titan spawn in that region. At least not very much, unless they're trying to proselytize, and then they'd probably just get killed.
Right.
So
you might find them there for a little while until they're eaten by someone else.
Yeah. But
why don't you give us your outro info?
Yeah, as I mentioned a couple times, I wrote this book, Vigilant, Through Shadows and Dreams, book 1, in which our hero does, in fact, it's big spoilers because the second half of the book, does get to explore some of the Haggard Hills and the Blood Steppes after tromping around through the Morning Marshes, because that's what Vigilants do. And maybe next week we'll talk more about Vesh and what the hell is a Vigilant, because I've only been talking about Vigilance for nearly a year on this show and not having talked about Vesh yet. So we should probably do that at some point. You can also find my work on Drive-Thru RPG, which I've got a good half a dozen or more titles of various D&D supplements for the Scarred Lands, and I pretend that I know a heck of a lot about this property. I do not work for Onyx Path, but I love writing crap about their universe and playing in their sandbox. So, and my website is morelikethisindustries.com.
Nice. And I am Jimmy Hochhalter. You can find me on Twitter at WHPubs, on Facebook, and here on Twitch at WH Publications. Follow along here on Twitch every Friday. Well, currently every Friday we're doing this. Next week we'll be doing Vesh. That's all I'm going to say this week because my voice is going out. So I will see you all next time. Bye.
Yeah. Bye.